All right. Well, today we're going to try to talk a little bit about a good name, I guess, versus a bad name. And the verses that kind of come to my mind to start it off to think through would be the one in Proverbs 22:1. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches and loving favor rather than silver and gold. And I think Micaiah had mentioned a little bit earlier. We've got Micaiah and Matthew with us today, but I think Micaiah had said something earlier. Riches can kind of fade away over time. Somebody spend it up, but your name, goes on forever and ever. And so a good name, and I think the other side of that maybe is Proverbs 10:7. The memory of the just is blessed, but the name of a wicked shall rot. And so what I have written in my, I've got in my mind is you got two things, either a good name or a rotten name. And, I know we're going to probably kick around a few names from the Bible, and I hopefully not kicking around too many people's names that we know, but the names from the Bible, we'll kind of throw those around. And I think of like Jezebel. One time I was trying to figure out what Jezebel's name meant, and when I came across it, I thought, that is crazy. It means chaste. So I don't know if they did it on purpose. I don't think her parents were the best of people either, but they at least named her discreet and chaste. And she certainly did not live up to that name. And so now, nobody when they're saying, okay, what do you want to call, our little girl? Let's call her Jezebel. Nobody does that because she made such a name for this that no one would, nobody's looking in name books and saying, what do we name our son? Hitler. Nobody does that. Nobody comes up with those.
Hitler.
Yeah, nobody calls them those names because they have made such a rotten name out of that. And so I think it's a good topic to think about. Us as people, what names are we making in our homes? I mean, I've got a name that I've been given by my parents. That's that name, but I'm also a son. And what kind of son am I? I'm also a husband. What kind of husband? Am I living up to that name? And then I'm father. What kind of name am I living up to with that? And so, what kind of name are you making? What kind of name are you living up to? I guess on the good side, we can come up with some good things. Right. And on the bad side, we can probably come up with some bad ways that we kind of do that. You look like you're just itching to say something.
I was just laughing because what we were talking about before, because, you were talking about how when you bring up gossip, you automatically think of someone in your mind, or drama queen, or someone who has a bad temper. And we were just talking about earlier how whenever we say bodybuilder, we think about Brother Eric.
Yes, correct.
Or, and then, donuts, you think of someone. So that's what I was smiling
Let
about.
me ask you a question. When you say that just now, because you remember we're talking about a good name or a bad name. When you think bodybuilder, do you think of me because you think that's what you should not look like if you're a bodybuilder? Is that kind of the idea? Or is it because you can tell that I'm cut up and I'm in great shape?
No comment. You're my boss. I
got it.
Yeah.
No problem.
He's just my pastor. You want me to comment on that?
I was going to say, because when I think of fired, I think of you sometimes. Yeah, that's the...
Fire?
Fired. Like,
oh,
get out,
fired.
Done.
Yeah. That's the name? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, you think about it, again, on the good side, you've got, Barnabas was somebody that they said, let's call him Barnabas, because that was his name. Let's call him Barnabas because he is such a consoler. He's such a good guy. So let's find a name that represents like a nickname of who he is. Right. This he's got such a great spirit about him. Let's call him by what his spirit is. Wouldn't that be the way we probably ought to be living, our lives as Christians in this community? Yeah. Is that people look at us and say, man, they're a comforter, they're genuine, they're real, they got a good spirit, they're happy, they're joyous, or whatever, instead of they're a gossip, they're angry, they're mean, whatever. Right. And so I think that's, this is a good topic to kind of look at today for us to kind of just evaluate what kind of name am I making. We were talking about this earlier. Some people don't even realize they're making a name for themselves.
Right.
If I was to say right now, if you were to say, arrogant, boom, a name would pop up, of somebody you would think of, but that person might not even realize that that's, that's what they are.
Right.
And they don't even know it.
Well, I mean, like I was making mention earlier, there's people who are building a reputation, and I would never, you never want to be critical and never walk up to people and be a jerk to them, but I would never let my kids, like my future kids, around those people, or I would never really want to associate, just because I'm like, that person's known for gossip, that person's known for drama. And so I would never be around those people. You just never know the reputation you're making for yourself. And I think the problem is, like, people don't care enough to ask if they have a blind spot, or ask if what's ways that I can improve in my life. Is there something that I do that I don't notice in myself? Because it's all about them. So they just continue to live their life the way they think they should live, and they think that they're doing it right. But in the back of, other people's minds, are like, that person really gets on my nerves, but they would never care enough to ask, okay, do I have a bad name? Do I have a bad reputation around here? Or am I building, or a reputation that people are like, I don't really enjoy being around. They're known around the church or around the neighborhood as that person.
They've created that name for themselves.
Right.
So. Matthew had a good point about some of this stuff a while ago. What was it? You think we were talking about Jeroboam.
So, Jeroboam, I've been studying up on him. He started out when Solomon's servant, so there is a name in itself. He was a mighty man of valor, right? That's a good name to have. Talking about bodybuilder over here, Mr. Pastor, not mighty man of valor. Anyway, he starts out and he is warned beforehand, if you do what God commands, that your house will be built.
Yeah.
And just like most of us that are probably listening in, we start out good with God. Like, we're warned. We've got the Bible right in front of us if we read it. Got all these things that are there, right?
Right.
Anyway, so what he's done is made a name for himself over the years that he was just an awful king.
Yeah.
Right? He brought in the 2 golden calves.
Yeah.
God was angry with him, and the reason why he done all this was so his people wouldn't go worship in another, basically like what we would call, like, from where we're at, going to Killeen.
Yeah.
Right? Don't go to Killeen and worship there. Stay here in Cove and worship with me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so God's angry with him. It says that he was like one of the worst kings that Israel had. And that right there in itself is awful.
And what a terrible name.
But you would think after he died that you wouldn't hear much about him throughout the rest of 1 Kings, 2 Kings. But several chapters over, it's still talking about him. All these kings are still fallen because of his sin.
Yeah.
He has made a name for himself over 250 years. God is still angry with him because of the sin that he did.
Yeah.
Like, that's to me is a name that is awful.
Yeah.
Right.
You said a while ago, you said something about it ripples in
Yeah, so I know myself, I see right in front of me, I think that my sins are only going to affect me, right? Like most of us.
Yeah.
Right.
I can sit like at home and drink or do whatever and think that that's only affecting me.
Yeah.
But that's going to affect my wife, that's going to affect mom and dad, that's going to affect everybody. Just like Jeroboam here, his sin affected 250 some odd years after he died.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just what am I doing within myself? It's not just affecting me, but that name affects everybody.
Right.
Right? So I'll give this testimony of myself. I've been in church my whole life, right? From the time I was born till now, 36 years. I would say lived a pretty Christian life for most part of it, right? Had a good name. I was preaching back at home, right? And there was several churches that would call me to come preach. I had a good name around the area. Fast forward till we move out here in Texas, and sin started to creep in, right? We would go drinking. I would have a good name within the church, and then people would see me in a different light outside the church. And what got me kind of thinking on having a good name, I thought about like my funeral, right? When I was doing all this.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for some reason, I think about my funeral a lot, which is crazy. Right? Anyway, so what I thought was, like, I'm a hypocrite. I'm going to have the church members on this side saying, oh, he was a good man. And then you're going to have the bar friends I had on this side going, what are we doing in a church house? I didn't know him like that.
Yeah.
Right? So
that's a good point.
You're going to have like...
So you would almost have two names.
Yeah, two names.
You got to... And so actually because you had two names, you hit it. What your name would be, possibly, would be hypocrite.
Hypocrite. Yeah, big time. And that's shameful.
Yeah.
There is no rest for the wicked.
Yeah.
Right? And I know that for a fact. Like, you think you're getting by. You start out, and there's a lot of times I'm like, me as a Christian, I want to help other Christians now because I know what that feeling is.
Yeah.
Right.
Like being a backslider, a transgressor.
Yeah.
It's not an easy road.
Yeah.
Like, you will lay awake at night going, man, I hope they don't find out.
Yeah.
Right? I hope these people don't find out. I hope there's Christians that don't walk into this bar. I hope there's other people that don't see me pull in. There's no rest for that.
Yeah.
And eventually that just gives you a horrible name.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to cover up your sins for a while, but they do catch up to you.
Well, so here you are sitting here with us at church doing the podcast, and things are, as far as I know, are much different about your life. I've known you for a long time, and what I know about you is I knew about that dip in your life, but that's not where you stayed. And so what's interesting about names, if we're talking about names, is I think we talked about this earlier, David. David starts off really good. David has a spot in his life where, like you're talking about, in fact, exactly what you're talking about. I think it's Psalm 32 where David talks about lying awake and in the heaviness and God's hand being against him and his his moisture drying up, meaning he cried himself out and all those things, and he's trying to cover it up and he's worried about it. And then he says he finally forsakes it and confesses it, acknowledges it. God gives him the blessing of that, and he moves on. And so he's still referred to later as the man after God's own heart. So you can have a dip in your life where you've kind of put a tarnish on the name, but you can rebuild that name back up again. I think that's what you've done in that story you're just giving, is just because the name starts out good, we would say it's not how you start, it's how you finish.
Right.
But just because you drop off doesn't mean you got to finish dropped off. You can still come back out of it and make a good name.
Right. I will say it takes support to get out of that dip. I've always said once you start, like, to dig a hole for yourself, you start one shovel at a time. And eventually you get to a point to where you can't get back out of it. And that's what a good name, calling on somebody like Pastor here to try to help you out of that hole, right? Like, you're not going to call on your drinking buddies and be like, hey, I need to do better. You're going to call on somebody that has a good name, that's established, that will tell you the truth about stuff, that's consistent in what they do to help you get out of that hole. And for me, that's like, I think for the first time in the past few months in a long time, I'm enjoying my salvation again. Like, waking up filled full.
Well, that's what David said, restored him in the joy of thy salvation.
Right.
And so you're getting the joy back. And that's a blessing. Because there's not a whole lot of joy when you're wondering, when you're hiding and you're wondering and you're dreading. It's not a whole lot of joy in that. And but when you're coming back to the other side of it, so now you're back to a person that so I'd say he's joyful.
Yes.
He loves, so you're making a name. It's all
there's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
And then we've got I will say with us, there's just blessings upon blessings, like not just from what I've done or God's done for me, but now that I'm back in it, like, family's starting to come back to church.
Yeah.
Right.
It's rippling that way now.
It's rippling that way. God's blessings are rippling.
Yeah.
Like, hopefully we're going to adopt. That would be a blessing. Yeah. Well, I won't say hopefully. I have a big God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
I was saying hopefully, but it's happening.
Yeah.
Right. In a ministry now, a prayer ministry.
Yeah.
Right.
And I hope that's blessing a lot of people. It is me.
Yeah.
Right.
It is. We're hearing about it in the community. People are talking about it. So it's interesting that we're saying a good name, and you've put the idea of the ripple effect with it. A good name has a ripple. A bad name has a ripple. And we've even established that you can even change it from, you can change your name from it's starting good, it drops off to being bad, but we also know that we can restore a name and make it better. And I thought about a few people that biblically, I thought about Saul. When you think of Saul, not King Saul, but the apostle Paul, when you refer to him as Saul, you're always referring to him as that guy that was persecuting churches. When you refer to him as Paul, you talk about the person that's starting churches.
Right.
And he just changed who he was, changed his name, changed who he was. And you said you got a big God. I thought about another one was Jacob, the supplanter. He doesn't even realize that he's the trickster. He's a supplanter until God puts him through some things, wrestles with him, changes his walk, like you're talking about, and changes his name, calls him Israel. And then now he's got a new name, a better name, a new walk, a new course of life. And the ripples that come from that are massive. And so I am glad that we serve a big enough God that can change a name and make a name better. And I'm grateful that that's what he's doing in you. I'm glad to see that that's what's going on in your life.
Same.
Yeah.
I'm glad I can't, I'm not big enough to mess up God's plan.
That's a good point.
Right. But at the same token, you look at Jeroboam, 250 years later, God's still angry with him.
Yeah. People are still following in his footsteps.
And I would think in his mind, he's doing what's right to him. Right? The love of money and riches. Right?
Yeah. Well, the point that we had kind of brought up earlier, a good name, it lives on past your life. And, there's a reason why, you don't get judged instantly after you die. We were talking about that. The judgment seat of Christ happens after everybody's life's over here on earth as a Christian. And so you go to heaven. Your life continues to impact people in a good or a bad way after you've died.
Yeah.
And so like you were talking about Jeroboam, 250 years, people are still impacted by his life in a bad way. But now, there's people that have set up and established something that they have passed on, but their life, because of the way they live, they established a church or they did something. Now it's still people are getting saved because of the investments that they've put in. And so that can be the testimony of your life, whether you live such a bad life where, let's just say you're a drug dealer. Well, now there's other people addicted to drugs who are affecting their families, and those things continue to go on past your life, the ripple effect. And so you can either do that in a good way and leave things that continue to move on past you, or you can leave that in a bad way. In that ripple effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been watching some football stuff, and I like watching coaching and leadership documentaries about men that have impacted people's lives, because that's kind of what a pastor is. He's a coach. He's impacting people's lives. He's trying to. Right. And I watched something that was John Madden said that he that his idol, so to speak, was Vince Lombardi. And he said Vince Lombardi, I don't even know where all these quotes came from and all the things that he did. And then I went and watched a documentary about Vince Lombardi. He pulled things from books that he read and the books about Napoleon, and he pulled all these quotes and all these thoughts and mindset and leadership principles from all these books he read, put it all together into football, and then he began to invest in men's lives through those philosophies. And then there's people that down the road never read the same books he read, never were part of the same things that he studied, but they were just impacted by Vince Lombardi, and then they went on and begin to impact other people's lives as well. And all these, you got guys now that are talking about something that John Madden did in their life. And if you listen to John Madden, he's saying the only reason why I invested that in their life is because I got it from Vince Lombardi, invested into my life. And those impacts just keep going from people to people to people, and just invests all the way through. And it does. There is something to that, about that ripple effect.
Right. I agree 100%.
I think we spend too much time. I think you got something you're going to say. I'll let you say it. But I think another thought with that you just brought up, which is really good, is sometimes when, let's say you started off good, and let's say you dipped down and you got messed up, and then you say, this is not the right place for me to be. I want my joy back. I want the blessing back. I want to be back on the right side of this. And you start trying to get back up. There's a very famous place in Scripture in Luke 15 about the prodigal. And right before this, it popped in my head about the prodigal, and I said, "Look up what prodigal." You remember what it was? The prodigal means like
It was like wasteful,
living lavishly.
living lavishly.
Right. So this is the name that we've given him in history.
Still to this day.
To this day, we call him the lavish waster, the prodigal, and people want to remember the bad about you,
Right.
instead of the good. You know what we should be calling him? The returner, the restored, the son, the father's son. We should be looking for a way to remember the good in people instead of the bad in people.
Right.
And so there's something to be said about, hey, when you mess up, people tend to remember that. So don't mess up.
Right.
But there's something for us to learn in that story about when someone is ready to restore, let them restore.
Right.
You which are spiritual, restore such a one.
Right.
That's what we're supposed to be doing, letting people get back up and make a better name for themselves.
Well, in Hebrews 11, God could have brought up every evil thing about those people.
Yeah.
He has Rahab in there.
Yeah,
he has a
yeah.
bunch of different people, but he chooses to bring out the
Great
positive
point.
thing in their faith. When of anybody, God could bring up the negative about
Absolutely.
you. His eyes are in all places, evil and the good. So he knows every single evil thing we've done. And with man, it's limited. And I would say if we do tend to remember the evil a lot of times, and we should remember the good about people, but that's why we should try to live a life that's so pleasing to God that people, when we do die, say, man, he really just loved God.
Yeah.
And we should live, I think consistency changes a name.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this earlier. Saul, whenever he changed to Paul and started living right, people were like, I don't know about this guy.
Give him some time.
He still had that reputation of, is he trying to sneak in here to do something? But that consistency said, no, this guy's serious. He's just not a talker, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to change. New Year's resolutions, I'm going to do this different. I'm going to do, and people always look, that guy, everybody talks. But, don't watch what someone says, watch what they do.
Yeah.
And, consistency can change your name. And we were talking about how maybe you lived one way. I think there's two perspectives. One, if you're a young person, you've not made a name for yourself yet, listening to this, choose to make a good name.
Yeah.
Choose to be consistent, live right. But if you're someone who has lived a life where you're like, people look at me a certain way, then make your mind up that I'm going to be consistent and live differently for the Lord now. And then I'm going to become so consistent in living for the Lord that people won't even remember what I did back then. And so that's a good thing. And I actually had a story here, and so you have to forgive me. This is a story I just wrote down before we were going to do the podcast, so I'm going to try to get it out smooth, but this was just an excellent story about changing your name. So this is a story about Alfred, and this is not Alfred from Batman, so with all the people that are getting excited, this was years before that. And so this Alfred was born in 1833 and was born in Sweden. And he really became intrigued with explosives and even met the man who invented nitroglycerin. So he just became into all of that stuff, like inventing explosives and just all these things. He actually ended up with over 355 patents that he had. And in 1867, he created something called Alfred's blasting powder, otherwise known as dynamite. He created dynamite. And I know a lot of us are familiar with, Looney Tunes and all those episodes of seeing all the dynamite, and that's probably what you're familiar with, with dynamite. But what dynamite was predominantly used for, just from its conception, was in mining and in warfare, and it was one of the deadliest weapons used in the Spanish-American war. And there's a whole history behind dynamite. We're not going to do all that because that's totally irrelevant for what we're talking about today. But Alfred, he loved inventing. And when you think, if you were to think of an 1800s Tony Stark, this is what this guy would be. I mean, he was literally a manufacturer. He was a playboy, philanthropist. I mean, he lived in a mansion. I mean, in his mind, he was doing fantastic. Well, there was one morning he woke up in 1888, and he goes outside to pick up his newspaper and open it up, and there was a picture of him in there with the headline, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." It was Alfred's obituary. They had mistaken him for his brother Ludwig, who had just passed away. And so they start talking about Alfred and just details about him, and it goes on to say that Alfred had become rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. Alfred looked at this and was mortified and spent the rest of his life completely impacted. And not a lot of people are able to look at their obituary before they die while they're still living.
Right.
But Alfred got to, like, just frozen time, was able to look into the future and see what people would have said about him. And so he by that one defining moment, he aggressively decided that he wanted to change the way that obituary would read. And so he got to work immediately to change that desired outcome. And when he died in 1896, he left half of his wealth to establish the Nobel Peace Prize. And Alfred Nobel is now known as the Peace Prize guy. So when you look back, now he's looked at as a guy who created inventions that will help society versus someone who invented things that would destroy it. Yeah. And that's how he had his name. When he looked at that obituary, he said, you know what, I'm going to make a change. And now he is known as the Nobel Peace Prize guy, not as the guy, the merchant of death, as you will. Yeah. And he was able to completely change his life and people's perspective of him. So I think if you do have a reputation as someone of anything, whether it's drugs, whether it's a gossip, a liar, you can completely change your whole reputation and just how people view you just by being consistent and living right.
Looking at his death.
Looking at his death. That's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, how would people...
I mean, if you really think about it, there's a lot of stuff in life you're going to look back and be like, oh, I wish I would have done this better or that better.
Right.
There's never a time where you're going to say, well, I wish I wouldn't have went to church as much. I wish I wouldn't have done as much for the Lord.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
That's true.
Absolutely. Well, that's good. I mean, so if we're listening, and I hope you are, then you've got a few different things to think about. One, I want to create a good name. The second might be if I've messed my name up, then get up and create a better name and use the time you have left. I guess another takeaway would be if it's somebody like us that are watching someone that has fallen, give them a chance to get back up.
Yeah.
Give them an opportunity to change their name.
Yeah.
Give them. I know sometimes youth will go to youth camps, and they'll come back home and they'll be like, "Yeah, I got saved," or I got right, or I did whatever. And I know there's probably some family members that are like, well, let's see. Let's just see how this works. Well, I think that's probably not the right spirit. The right spirit would be, let's give you everything that you need to succeed in that new name, that new direction.
The prodigal son's brother.
Yeah, that's the story.
I've been here the whole time. You didn't kill a fatted cat
that's
for
what
me.
That's what that story is actually about. The focus is not as much on the prodigal as it's about the older son. Because that story, in fact, that entire chapter, if you look at the beginning of it, is about Pharisees.
Right.
And it's about Pharisees not rejoicing over one that has repented and that they should. And so we don't want to be a Pharisee. We don't want to be someone that doesn't let someone get back up once they've fallen, doesn't let them change their name. We want to be somebody that embraces people rising back up, and we want to see them change a name and make something good for themselves. Right. So that's a good podcast. I enjoyed that. That was good. It's a good one to think about and kind of get our mind wrapped around. Right. So praise the Lord. Well, thanks for visiting with us and being with us on this one. Hope to get to see you again real soon. God bless you.